If you've been following along our videos here at the Kali Plants channel, then you might have noticed that most, if not almost all of them, are being shot here inside the greenhouse. And I have recently realized that I haven't talked to you about the experience of growing succulents in a greenhouse. So in today's video, that's what we're going to be focusing about. We're going to go over the pros and cons of growing succulents inside a greenhouse. So I have here listed 3 pros and 3 cons when it comes to growing succulents in a greenhouse. So we have our advantages and our disadvantages, and these are all based on my experience. So you might have a different experience if you're in a different location or depending on the type of greenhouse that you have. But I'm hoping that the information that I share in this video will also help those who are planning to build a greenhouse for their succulents, especially if they're living in the same condition, the same climates that I have here in the Philippines. So the first pro that I have listed here, the first advantage of having a greenhouse, is you have protection against the wind, the sun, and the rain, and also you have some protection against animals. Now, I have experienced before growing succulents without a greenhouse. So if you've been following my older videos, then you would know that I don't have a greenhouse before, and back then I had to entrust my succulents to the mercy of the sun and the rain. And also when I was acclimating back then, I had to move my succulents back and forth inside and outside the greenhouse just so they can get some protection during the hottest parts of the day. So I had to move them back and forth. But now that I have the greenhouse, I can just station my succulents here even if they're still new, and they will be fine. I don't have to worry about them even if they get sun and they get rain, because they're protected by the shade net of the greenhouse and the roof of the greenhouse. Also, I had experience before with wind, because here in my place, we get a lot of strong winds, especially during the colder months of the year. I had my succulents when it was back then, when it was winter. I had them on the terrace of our house, and I think this would be a good story to tell. So I had them placed there. They were in a table, and we had guests come over, and they had to sleep in the house. But since that we don't have a lot of rooms, they wanted to sleep at the balcony, at the terrace balcony, so at the outdoor space of our house. And when the wind blew, all my plants, or some of my plants, just toppled over, and then their potting mix just flew onto our guests because they were laying on the floor. They had mats laid out and they were sleeping on the floor, and the wind blew in and my plants just dropped their potting mix on our guests. So it was really an embarrassing moment for me. So now I don't have that issue because I have my plants here at the greenhouse. Even if they get toppled over, no one's gonna get potting mix on them, so they have their own separate place. And yeah, most of the time I don't see any plants here toppling over due to the wind because they're very much protected. But still, we have to find it out this coming winter season, because this greenhouse haven't had experience with a winter season here in our place. But here in our place, we get a lot of very strong winds, so we're gonna be testing the strength of this greenhouse. Also, we have some protection when it comes to animals, because before we had neighbors that are raising chickens, and the chickens constantly come over here in our place, and they sometimes peck on the plants. I used to have a plant shelf here, and even if it was a separate space for my succulents, even if they were in a in a protected area, the chickens can still come to them. So they're still not fully protected when it comes to those chickens. So I sometimes find my succulents, they have these bite marks on their leaves, so it's a really sad thing to have. So now that I have them here stationed at the greenhouse, I don't have that much issue anymore. So they have more protection, so the chickens cannot get to them. So the chickens might get over there at the back side of the greenhouse, where I have some empty space, empty table. So you can see there, I keep that table vacant so that I can make my potting there. So the chickens can get to that, but they won't be able to get to this other part of my succulents. So they will not be able to damage these succulents because they cannot step on this. And if you notice that my arrangement here, since they are all packed together, the cats also don't get to them. So dogs don't climb tables, and cats sometimes they will climb tables, but if they find that there's a lot of stuff on the tables, so the cats won't be walking around this they will be avoiding this. That's how cats are. They try to avoid damaging anything. So if you have your plants packed together in a table much like this, then you will have some protection against those cats and those chickens and those other animals that you might have in your location. The first con that I have here, the first disadvantage when it comes to having a greenhouse, is that it can get hot during the hotter parts of the day. So especially if it's in the middle of the summer when there's no rain. So even if they have some protection, they have some shade net over them, the temperatures can still rise since it's a closed environment, so it can get really hot inside, and it makes it more difficult to maintain your plants if it's very hot, because you don't want to be going out in those heat. So you want to avoid that. Even if you really want to grow your succulents, even if you really want to care for them, if it's really difficult for you or really uncomfortable for you, then you will not be staying in the greenhouse for very long if it's too hot. Now, to keep my greenhouse cool, I try to leave the far side of the greenhouse open so I don't have plastic on there. And please pardon the hanging clothes there, the clothes that we are drying. So please pardon that. So I have that space of the greenhouse open so that the wind can come in, and also I have the front part of the greenhouse open as well so that the wind can come in and out. And since we have a lot of wind here in my place, then this greenhouse can stay pretty much cool if we get wind. And also I'm thankful that we're in a little bit of a cooler climate here in the Philippines. We're a little bit of a highland location here. So we have a very short summer which we just went through. So about a month ago we had 3 months of heat, so we didn't get a lot of rain during those times. But my echeverias really grew a lot during that time since they have some amount of protection. But my other succulents that doesn't perform well in the sun, in the heat, then they suffered a little bit, so that might be an issue for you. And also since we have this short amount of summer, we have a shorter summer season, we have a longer winter season, we have a longer rainy season. So now we're already starting into our rainy season, which runs from July until to December. So until to December and probably until to January. So we have this really rainy season here in the Philippines. So really you would only have to bother about the heat during the hotter parts of the year. And if you already have a greenhouse that is not ventilated well, then it might be an issue for you, especially if you have this small greenhouse that looks like a closet. Those greenhouses in Shopee or in Lazada, they sell these closet style greenhouses that look like shoe racks, and then they just place a cover over it. So those can get very hot since it's a small covered area. So if you have a wider, bigger greenhouse, then there's more air circulation, then the heat doesn't tend to build up. And also I would recommend that you move your roof much higher away from the plants since the heat will be concentrated there. So you see here my roof have some shade net, so you can see there. So inside those shade net, if it's in the middle of the heat, so if it's in the middle of the day, the heat can tend to collect inside of the shade net and under the roof, so that part of the greenhouse gets very hot. So I believe that if the roof of your greenhouse is very close to your succulents, so if they're much more lower to your succulents, then the heat will be much more focused on your succulents. So your succulents will get more concentrated heat. So I would recommend really that you avoid that by building your greenhouse higher away from your succulents. The second pro that we have here is that the consistent light and consistent humidity really speeds up the growth of succulents. So I've noticed that with my plants back then when I still didn't have a greenhouse, they were kind of slow growing. I already know that succulents are slow growing, but I was actually surprised that when I had the greenhouse built and I had them placed here, they really had this consistent growth. So I really noticed a lot of growth with my plants. Even with my newly planted succulents, the ones that I just recently bought, they produce a lot of development quickly if they're in a greenhouse, and that's especially true when it comes to cacti. So I recently have my cacti featured on my Facebook page. I didn't actually have a lot of success with growing cacti, but when it was summer here in my place, I really saw a lot of development on my cacti. So I believe that the greenhouse is really good for growing cacti, and that is also true when it comes to echeverians since they are summer growers. So if they get a lot of heat, if they get consistent light, and then they don't get a lot of UV rays. So if they're protected during the hotter parts of the day, then they can already produce a lot of growth. And since we have some protection with the rain, then you will not have to worry about the farina of your succulents getting dull. I used to have that problem when I was growing succulents in an open space where they get rain and they get sun, so they can get sunburned, and also their farina can be washed away by the water that gets onto their leaves. So now that they're in a more protected area, their growth is much more consistent and they look much more beautiful. They get protection from the rain, so their farina doesn't get brushed off easily. And also because it's a little bit humid here in my place, here in the greenhouse, then they can also produce growth. So succulents, some other people think that they really need to be very dry, but I think that we have to avoid that thinking right now, because I think that succulents really need some amount of humidity, but not a lot. If they get some amount of humidity, it really helps them grow much more faster. I believe that humidity also helps with the roots, so it keeps the roots alive and they root much more quicker if it's in a more humid location. So let me just add that even if I have my shade net here, my succulents don't etiolate that much. So their growth is really compact. They have their central rosettes growing really low, so their central rosettes doesn't grow up. Okay, so you can see here that the central rosette is much more lower than the outer part of the leaves, so they don't etiolate that much. And also you can adjust the shade net to your liking. So if they're already etiolating with the shade net that you are using, then you can use a lower percentage of shade net so that they won't etiolate as much. But even with the 50% shade net I have here, they don't etiolate that very much. So I have here my succulents, they're still very compact. So you can see here, the leaves are very compact. They don't grow this etiolated long leaves. So I have that. I can avoid that because of the consistent light that we have here in the greenhouse. The second con of having a greenhouse for your succulents is that you have to be mindful of the watering of your plants, because since it's also very hot, since it can get very hot during the hotter parts of the day, so if you don't water your plants or if you don't watch over watering them, then they can get heat stress, they can wrinkle very quickly, and also they can get burned. And also, as I said before, since succulents grow a lot in a greenhouse, then you also might want to water your succulents a little bit more compared when you were growing them indoors. So if you're growing them in your balcony or if you're growing them in your living room, then you might not have to water them a lot. But if you're already growing them in a greenhouse and they're in a southern part of your house, if they get tons of light, then you might have to be really mindful of watering them, because you cannot rely with rain anymore to water your plants, because you have some protection on them. So if you don't give them water, then they will dry out very quickly. So I find that when I was growing succulents here in the greenhouse, I have to water a lot during some times of the week. So probably I will water about every Monday, and then I will also water about every Thursday. So I will not water everything in one day, so I will let them dry out. Some of them doesn't dry out at the same time, so some of them will dry out quickly, so I have to water those. And those that are not dry yet, I will just let them dry out before I water them. So I still wait for my succulents to dry out before I water them. And during those times, probably in Monday or Thursday, I have to water a lot of my succulents. So a lot of them will already be dry. They will already need to be watered. So I have to water a lot. And then when it comes to the next watering day, I will also have to water a lot. Because I find that if I don't water my succulents, then they will really suffer, and also they will not grow a lot. But I also find that even if I don't water my succulents, they will not die right away. So they might suffer when it comes to heat, but if they're not in a very full sun location, so this part of the greenhouse actually gets full sun, but if they're in a more protected space like here on the other side of my greenhouse, so if they're there, you can see my coffee there. So since this gets a lot more protection, even if I don't water the plants here, they can still live for about 2 weeks, 3 weeks without watering, so I don't have that issue. I will just have to transfer them in a more shaded area here in my greenhouse if I'm not gonna be watering them. So that's just what I have to remember, since I still forget sometimes that my succulents, I don't water them and they get full sun and they get burned. So some succulents I have here still get burned, but if I give them consistent watering or if I give them some protection, then it will not be an issue anymore. On the last pro, or on the last advantage of having a greenhouse, is that everything is in one place and it's much more easier to maintain and much more easier to care for plants if they're all in one place. So I used to have different plants stationed at different parts of my house, and it can get really tiring if you're gonna have to maintain everyone all at the same time. So if you're moving back and forth in the front of your house and at the side of your house, then it can get quite tiring. So I really have that issue before. I wasn't caring enough for my succulents because they were scattered all over the place. So now that they're more organized, they're in one place, then it's much more easier to care for them. And also, as you can see here, okay, you might be able to see that. So I have all my pots, my potting mixes in that place, and also I have my tools over there, so they're all in one place. So if I need to do some maintenance and if I need to clean my plants, then they're just right there. And also I have some water collection over at that part of the house, so I can get some rainwater on my plants. I can collect some rainwater on them. And also I have here, I recently cleaned this greenhouse actually. You can see here there are some pots there. There are some other materials for potting mixes, so I have everything there. So it's really easy, really convenient to care for plants. And I find that if it's more convenient for you to care for your succulents, if you have everything organized, then it makes the experience much more better. It makes the experience much more easier. So if you have that experience, if you really feel like you're relaxed while you are growing succulents, then you will be able to care for them more. So if you're getting really inconvenienced by growing succulents with the setup that you have in your location, then it might be quite difficult for you. So if you have your stuff scattered all over the place and you really have to find where your tools are, if you're growing succulents, if you're already maintaining them and you still have to look for your tools, if they're all over the place, and it might get quite difficult. And also you might not be able to care for your plants as much compared when you are organized. So with a greenhouse, you can get much more organized when it comes to caring for your succulents. Now, the last con that I will say is that the greenhouse itself needs maintenance. Now, if you don't have a greenhouse, then you might not need to maintain your space. But since building this greenhouse, I find that I really have to maintain the greenhouse itself. So I need to make adjustments on the shade net because we get varying sunlight depending on the season that we have. So we might get sun over here if it's summer, and also we might get sun over here if it's winter. So you have to adjust your shade nets. And also, even if you have a roof over here, the floor can still get quite dirty because you might have your potting mix like dropping on the floor. You might have to sweep that up. And also the tables can get very messy if you're doing a lot of maintenance. Your potting mix can, you know, go all over the place, so you have to sweep that up. So it's really a part of having a greenhouse. You have to maintain the status of your space, so you have to maintain everything. And I believe that we still need to make some painting on the steel so that they won't rust. So really, that's just part of having a greenhouse. You have to maintain it. You have to make sure that the greenhouse itself is in good shape. And also, I find that even if I have my UV plastic over here, if it gets a lot of wind, then the attachment of the UV plastic, so it's actually attached with these hooks on the steel. So if it gets a lot of wind, then those attachments might get loose. So you have to really tighten that up so that the plastic will not be blown off by the wind. But I find that if I had a lot of hooks on my greenhouse plastic, then I won't have to worry about them. So I will probably show you a clip of the hooks that I use on my greenhouse plastic. So you might find that the cons or the disadvantages that I have here doesn't outweigh the benefits, the advantages of having a greenhouse. Still, the advantages, the pros are much more better than the cons of having a greenhouse. So I would really recommend that if you have the money for it and if you have the space to build a greenhouse, I would really recommend that you build a greenhouse so that you can have much more healthier, much more beautiful succulents in your care. So I think that's about all I can say when it comes to having a greenhouse with the experience of having a greenhouse. If you have any concerns or if you have any questions about having a greenhouse, please make sure to comment down below. I will try to answer it as soon as I see your comments. And also, if you really like the information that I shared with you in this video, please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe. And that's about it for this video, guys. I will see you on the next one. Bye bye.